My name is Daniel Stid. I'm the director of the Madison Initiative at the Hewlett Foundation, and I'll be moderating today. Let me just quickly introduce our panelists. Working from your left, my right, Bob Slavin is the co-founder and chairman of the board of Success for All, a winner of multiple I3 grants, and Bob also is affiliated with Johns Hopkins. To my immediate right is Carla Javits, the president and CEO of REDF and Social Innovation Fund grantee. To my left is Aviva Aron-Dine, who is Associate Director for Economic Policy at OMB. To Aviva's left is Michael Brown, the CEO and co-founder of CityYear, the recipient of an I3 grant. And Michael, I was hoping you'd have the red jacket, but I guess not today. But
Underneath.
Okay. And then on my far left is Nadya, Dabby, who is Assistant Deputy Secretary for Innovation and Improvement at the Department of Education. So our remit today really goes back to a chart that Jim Shelton, who will be our wrap-up speaker, drew at a meeting that Michelle hosted about 18 months ago. And he kind of laid out this, Jim's a great charter, so he laid out in a whiteboard a histogram of the Department of Education's budget, of which the vast majority was this blank space, and then they drew a little sliver over at the edge, which was meant to represent the innovation funding that he was overseeing. And he said, really, the task for all of us is to figure how to take the lessons and insights and models that we are investing in here and weave that into this base load of the department's budget, and you can extrapolate that across the federal government. And as Michelle noted at the outset, we're making some headway there, but there's a lot more headway to make. So what we're going to do today is we're going to hear initially from the recipients of these grantees who have been doing deep work for a long period of time in different places out in the field and get their take on what the opportunities are to repurpose this funding. And then we'll hear from our colleagues in government and then have a bit of a conversation up here and open it up. So that will be the broad flow for today. But effectively what we want to do throughout is be identifying specific opportunities through which the lessons and insights and models that have been tested and established through the innovation funds could be informing the broader scope of government funding. So, Carla, maybe we could start with you, and would love to hear, what you see as the opportunities that have been most apparent to you in your work.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here today with an incredible group of people. So I wanted to speak about a couple things just parochially that might be interesting, because these are sort of examples more from our point of view in terms of the work that we do, and then a couple of examples that maybe, or a couple of thoughts that are a little broader. So basically, for people who face big barriers to work, opportunity youth, incarcerated, homeless, we create a way into the workforce. That way is basically what we call employment social enterprise, basically businesses that intentionally employ these individuals and provide them with the support that they need to move on into the mainstream workforce while earning revenue from the business itself, which obviously makes for a more sustainable and cost-effective approach. We are a Social Innovation Fund grantee. We've been able to do an evaluation. We have the interim results of that evaluation. We're seeing the evidence of impact. We know that there are slots, if you will, for hundreds of thousands of people around the country in businesses like this, but we need millions of this kind of job for people to kind of take that first step and move on. And there are a lot of people, millions of people, who can work but don't have that chance. So government has been peripatetically involved. I would say this is an innovation that's bubbled up from the community. Sometimes it's been involved, sometimes it hasn't. The workforce system's a good example. That basically focuses on people who were unemployed recently, and all the incentives are there to help them, not people with bigger problems who will have, it'll be tougher to get them employed. So what can we do? What could we do to try to really stimulate growth at scale and kind of take this into the mainstream? First of all, I think other countries, notably the UK, Australia, other places, they've been using a lot more of these tools, so this isn't just a pipe dream, it's actually being done in other places to fuel growth. So number one, there's a concept called social procurement. And I think in a sense you heard a comment about that earlier with, the government spent a lot on infrastructure, and then we had the great news that we laid more roads, but we employed fewer people. So how do we use government money and incent the private sector to buy from firms that actually care about the employment of people who otherwise wouldn't have a chance, and once they get them employed, provide decent jobs and then the opportunity to advance. So there's a lot we can do around that. Notably, the SBA, the Small Business Administration, defines most nonprofits not as businesses. So they only allow for-profits to benefit from all of the incentives, the technical assistance, the money, the definition as sort of supplier diversity, if you will, that then drives private companies to purchase from them. So that's something else that could change. There's a SEED Act, a Social Enterprise Act, moving through Congress that begins to open up the door to these kinds of definitions. That could get passed. Second point, so there's social procurement. Second point, we need business startup and expansion capital. While we have some impact investing funds in this country, we don't have this at the scale that we need, and certainly not focused on businesses that intentionally employ people who face barriers. The Community Reinvestment Act, we have the regulators clarify that banks get credit under the CRA when they invest in for-profits and nonprofits that intentionally employ people. We could have a fund. In the UK, they've set up a big society capital fund. They've used dormant bank accounts and big banks to fuel it. It funds intermediaries that in turn fund social enterprise. We could do more of that. The community development is the CDFI fund, basically, which we now capitalizes community banks, basically, could do a lot more to educate about investment in employment social enterprise and target some of the funding there. Pay for success, social impact bonds. We're working with the Center for Employment Opportunities. We're very excited about that on a California project that would model on the great work they're doing in New York. We see a real opportunity there to expand capital. And I would just mention there's a U.S. Commission on Impact Investing that's about to come out with a set of recommendations on how to mobilize a lot more capital to invest in social enterprise and other social purpose programs, and I think they have a lot of great recommendations in there. So lastly, I guess on the parochial, I would say subsidizing services to keep people employed. We need, and help them advance. We need to bolt those on to social enterprise, so that's more an integration question. And then lastly, I think making work pay. Obviously, we have an earned income tax credit for families with children, but it's not expansively used yet for individuals. And we have, I think there we could make a lot of progress, and some obviously are advocating for a higher minimum wage. I think, I don't want to go on too long, but I think on the broader agenda, people have talked about this, but, I do think in the mainstream programs, earmarking a percentage of the funds that are flowing out in competitive programs, other kinds of mainstream programs for evidence-based projects, as well as leaving some room for those that have a good model, a good approach, some evidence perhaps, but are really trying to build toward it. But trying to just drive that through the mainstream programs is really critical. And then, it was mentioned earlier, but I don't think you can overstate it. Money for evaluation is going to be critical. If we don't have that, we can't come up with the results. The groups on the ground are just not going to be able to raise this purely from philanthropy. So the public sector's got to be involved with that, and they need to be providing us with the administrative data, frankly, to make it simpler and more cost-effective to do those kinds of evaluations. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Bob?
Okay. We have our main program is a whole school reform model called Success for All, and I won't tell you much about it, but it's a program primarily for elementary and middle schools, focused on building reading skills for all children, trying to follow children carefully, give them preventive activities or high-quality instruction throughout the grades, and then identify kids who need tutoring or eyeglasses or health services or whatever they might need to get on track if they're having difficulties in school. We work in high poverty schools in 40 states all over the U.S. There is a lot of very high quality evidence showing the impact of Success for All over a period of time, and that's why we qualified for scale-up funding under the I3 system. So that's just background, but let me go forward from that and talk a bit about how you might have a system of policy that would support evidence into practice. Obviously, the beginning of it is to have something that is creating a lot of programs that are likely to be effective and finding out which ones actually are and helping them to build strong organizations to be able to support those programs as they go into scale up. So this is actually the area in which I3 and IES within the world of education are making enormous strides in terms of building up the shelf, the armamentarium of promising or effective programs for people to use. The difficulty is that the main impact of these investments has been in terms of building up the shelf, in terms of actually then affecting how these proven programs get used in policy, how they affect actual practices in Title I or in school improvement grants or in other parts of the education system. This linkage has not yet been made, but it could be made. The argument that I would make is that we need a system first focused on competitive grants. You can't focus on formula grants first because formula grants are hard to influence and they're heavily defended by many kinds of interests. That's not to say that you can't get to them, but you shouldn't start with them. But we don't need to start with them as long as there is a competitive grant process anywhere, in any field, not just education, in which evidence is not front and center. My suggestion is along the lines of offering competitive preference points in competitive grants. For example, imagine that you could get on a 100-point scale, that you could get a 4 points additional if you are a school that is adopting a program with strong evidence of effectiveness as defined by Edgar or in other consensus definitions of what strong evidence of effectiveness might be. And that you might get 2 competitive preference points if you choose something that meets a moderate standard of effectiveness. This would be extraordinarily impactful in terms of people sitting up and taking notice, but not so powerful that it would squeeze out, that would force people to take on one of these programs. I mean, the idea would be to try to find just the right numbers to make it possible for people to say, you know what, I don't like any of those programs, and we've got better stuff in our town, and don't feel like doing it, so I'm just going to put in a proposal that doesn't propose any of those things, but makes a good argument about what we would rather do. Fine. If you want to do that, you can forgo the points. But on the other hand, no grant writer ignores 4 points lightly. They would have to take a look and say, what are these things? Let's find out about them and take a look at them and see whether that might be something we could use. Mm-hmm. What it would do in terms of then, in addition to providing an incentive for people on the ground to take a look at effective programs, is it would provide, for providers of these programs, it would provide kind of a stepwise sense of where you could be within a few years. That if you have no good evidence behind your program yet, but you've got a good theory of action, you've got some preliminary things that make you optimistic, you think, well, you know, if we could get 2 points on 2 competitive preference points, that would be a really big advantage. That's worth investing in. and for whoever invests in those programs, be it government or private agencies or others, that could be a good place, to begin without having a sense that you have to have a monster randomized experiment, third party, right the next week. And it would begin to squeeze the formula programs. In other words, just by having more and more of these things coming out in competitive grants, the formula programs would also be hearing about the same programs, because it's often the very same people who write the grants or who administer the formula grants as those who administer the competitive ones. And if people were seeing that the competitive grants were producing good things, they might start paying attention, though they wouldn't have to, but they would be more likely to. And over a period of time, those could become more and more part of policy or recommended among the formula grants, as well as just using bully pulpit and other opportunities to kind of encourage people to use their formula money on things that have strong evidence of effectiveness. So it's not like something that could be done overnight, but it's something that individual agencies without congressional action, I think, could do to start moving the field in a productive direction where it's softest, where it's most possible to make a difference in the near term.
Okay, thank you. Michael, do you want to take up this question now?
Sure. I think it may be the case that Sidir may be sort of the poster child for this transformation, because we started as a general service corps, basically saying, how can we be the yeast and the bread of other nonprofits? And we weren't data-driven in the impact that we were seeking at the time. We were also trying to have the double-edged coin of national service and invest in the young people themselves. So we did do studies on young people and found, to our delight, when they came out, and you hold your breath until these things do, that young people in national service at Sidir were more likely to vote and more likely to have friends of a different background and be volunteers the rest of their life. But the question still was, what is the impact that they're having? So we stepped back about 9 years ago with a big strategic plan that whittled down to one question, is how could we have more impact? And we found that 70% of our teams were being deployed into schools. But it wasn't a decision that I was making, it was being made at the local level. And they were doing many different things. Some of it was very exciting, like differentiating instruction. And some of it wasn't so exciting, like erasing whiteboards and moving chairs around. We decided to do less of that and more of this, and commit fundamentally to the space. And at the same time, two other things were happening. Grad Nation was forming, I know John Gompertz is here, and the whole idea of the entire sector coming together around the high school dropout crisis and public education. And Dr. Robert Balfance, who was here, came out with a series of breakthrough studies that found that there were these early warning indicator systems, or rather early warning indicators that can predict who's likely to drop out of high school. And I think it's probably relevant. A lot of this discussion, of course, is about policy. So it's about sort of how can we affect things from the top down to a degree. I'm sort of at the bottom level of sort of an organization kind of looking up, and I had an epiphany when I saw the Philadelphia Education Fund's graph that they had done with Dr. Balfance. They tracked all the Philadelphia students from grade 6 through 12 for 6 years. And it actually should be a straight line. You should go from 6th grade to 12th grade in 6 years. But of course it doesn't. It's about a 50% dropout. And then when they put early warning indicators against it and the colors of those lines came up, I was like, look at that. Look at what's really, you can actually affect by what's actually happening in the building, graduation rates. And I had this feeling that if we could take the entire city or core in their red jackets and go under that curve, we could sort of give them a bridge. And young people could affect, through their near-peer relations and using evidence-based practices, these research-based metrics. They could actually affect absences, behaviors, and course performance. So we retooled everything we were doing around metrics. Before we were sort of like anything came down on us, it was like this was an epiphany of where we wanted to go. We wanted to have more impact. And then we had this other epiphany of working with Dr. Balfance and with Dan Cardinale at Communities and Schools, and realized that for the highest need schools, secondary schools that have the most students that are either dropping out of high school or way off track, one organization alone is not enough. You need whole school reform, you need social work at scale, and you need these near-peer mentors. So we designed something called Diplomas Now, which actually has all groups doing the same thing, but with common metrics. And I think the idea of groups sharing common metrics, not just co-location, is an interesting policy point. Everybody wants to say nonprofits should all work together, but the key is that we make sure that they're actually following common metrics. And so we do that now, and really Dr. Balfance led on the I3, and we were part of that along with communities and schools. And we won the largest secondary school reform trial, randomized control trial in the country, which we're about 3 years in now, and we'll be back hopefully with good news in 2015 with the first cohort that will be told whether or not folks have reached the 10th grade to a higher degree than folks in the randomized control study. But I can tell you that 13% of my organization is Diplomas Now, which is under the I3, and 87% isn't. It's using just our own organization's work. But what's happening is the I3 work is driving all of the evidence in the rest of the organizations. Like they say, you put like a drop of yogurt in milk and it all changes the milk because it's a live culture. So we use early warning indicator grade group meetings that was designed through the Diplomas Now collaboration all across the country now. And we use conditions for success that we had to drive into the I3 schools. We had to develop 12 conditions for success among our 3 organizations. It's asking a lot of schools in terms of doubling down on kids that are behind, making sure that we have dosage, making sure that we have data agreements. Now we're driving all of that through every single school that we do. So my message to other nonprofits in this space is come on in, the water's fine. And that, in fact, it's important for nonprofits to go into this space and to be advocates for the policy, and not be seen as something that comes down to them, but actually they're coming up to it as well. And so some of my very quick policy ideas on this. The next generation of national service and social innovation, I think, is very exciting. It's really already underway, but the next innovation for national service that's sort of already underway is the idea of agency cores. So instead of just the national service money being in the Corporation for National Community Service, more money is actually in every single agency in the federal government. So there's a movement afoot, and President Obama has directed all of his offices, all of his departments, to look for funds to use for national service in the Department of Energy, in Justice, in Labor. And frankly, those agencies are more focused on actually meeting missions of those agencies. If you can create national service corps tied to those agencies that use evidence-based practice and data-driven methods, I always think it's easier to try something new and to reform rather than reform the old. And I think we're all in agreement on that. So actually using that, and then using the social innovation funds and driving them into departments too. So they aren't isolating and siloed in just the Corporation for National Community Service, but all departments are using them. A second thought is to align I3 evidence-based organizations now that are emerging. There's been 5 rounds of I3 now, and as that comes forward, if there are indeed results, providing priority for SIG grants and for Title I partners through those. A third idea is Title I is, especially Title I Part A, it's formula funding, it's hard to influence it. But could there be bonus money if you are actually using evidence-based practices? A little bit of a race to the top concept. The government says, oh, well, you can have 110% of your formula money if either in that 10% or all 110% you're using practices and using partners that have actually used these kind of evidence. So you use the carrot rather than the stick on that one. Also, I would suggest that if government and philanthropy can invest in nonprofits and help us, expose us to data, expose us to rigorous practices, show the pathway, give grants to say, these are the things you're passionate about. Did you know this is the data that affects it? Did you know these are the evidence-based practices that could most help you manage that? And help with this transformation of organizations. Also, cities and states are the laboratories of democracy. The School Turnaround AmeriCorps program at the federal government is very exciting. States and cities could adopt things like that and provide innovation funds for turning around schools that are also evidence-based. And then I guess if there's one sort of caveat in all of this, I would say that came up in our nonprofit meeting, we do have to be careful that government doesn't set certain goals that are misaligned. So the early warning indicators are absences, behaviors, and course performance. But actually, OMB doesn't let AmeriCorps programs actually do grades, which is course performance. We're not allowed to report on grades in order to actually meet our mission. That's a misalignment of this great research that Dr. Balfance has done. And at the same time, many kids have more than one early warning indicator. but we're not allowed to actually say this kid, we're working on 3 indicators. We actually have to pick a kid and an indicator to say whether or not we're effective when kids have as many as 4 indicators, as the research has shown. So aligning all this is sort of the next great task.
So I just want to pick up on one thing you mentioned, Michael. Before you got into your opportunities, you referenced the fact that that smaller portion of your work that was funded by the I3 and the lessons you were learning from that, you were really bringing those into the 80%. And as we think about opportunities to repurpose more government money to support the learnings from this investment, I think that was a really fresh idea, because I think we've been thinking, how can we get government to change? But to your point, insofar as there's a lot of money out in the installed base of service providers, they themselves need to be thinking about how we repurpose. So, okay, so we've got the bottom-up perspective, and we'll dive into each of those more in a bit here. Now we're going to get the bottom-up, outside in, and we're going to shift from that to the more top-down, inside-out, beginning with our with Nadya speaking from the perspective of the Department of Education, and then we'll come back and hear from the perspective of OMB. So Nadya, as you think about the opportunities to shift this funding towards better solutions, what are the ones that are foremost in your mind?
So I think these are the right set of opportunities here, right? And I think your point is well taken on making it clear that the water's not so cold, right, and that people can kind of step into this work, and that it can be transformative for the impact that they want to have and for the people doing that work. And I think certainly this concept of really making sure that we are, to use Bob's terminology, kind of building the shelf of evidence is incredibly important, because we're not going to be in a universe where we can say to people, hey, do all these different things that will really work and get you better results if we don't actually have something to point to. So I think those are sort of some of the key ones that I think are going to be really important. I think hearing that from people who are doing this work is actually incredibly important, and I should follow that by saying that the only reason I have anything to say here today is because of the diligence of the folks who actually get our funds doing this work, and there's a bunch of you out in the audience, and there's a few of you on the panel with me, and so we are incredibly grateful to all of you for taking that on. I think the sort of rub comes in some of sort of what it actually takes to convert that to a reality within the federal government, and sort of given the tools that we have at our disposal. That's the right general orientation. Our ability to kind of convert that and really make that real is actually very contingent on a bunch of folks in this room, including us at the federal government level, doing a host of things differently. Do you want me to talk about some of how I think about some of those potential barriers? Just trying to follow your protocol here. So one piece that came up earlier that I just want to sort of harp on for a second here is just this question around the timing of all of this work. So I have a sort of peculiar distinction of thinking of my life in 4-year cycles. I'm very aware that I have 33 months to go. And the sort of notion of when we sort of find out about what's working, when we sort of learn about sort of all of the different mechanics around helping government play Moneyball in different ways, the ability to actually put that into practice and make that sort of have it be sticky in ways that are meaningful, and also to have something to say in the short run is actually really tricky. And it's sort of worth just emphasizing how hard that is to get right. And so sort of the more that we hear from all of you who are doing this work about what the work looks like, how it's actually playing out, where we're getting it right and where we're getting it wrong, the better we can do that. But it's a pretty constrained environment on that front. I think the second piece goes a little bit to a piece that Bob was mentioning around kind of building out the shelf. And I think that's right. You want to have a shelf of here are things that work for whatever particular problem you're trying to solve. I think that's why we're all here. But the mechanisms for that kind of knowledge transfer are not very good. And those are challenging in any field. So this is not unique to my particular field of education. It's not unique to workforce development. It's not unique to any particular field, but it's pretty difficult. And in particular, I would say certainly in my field, and I think in a fair number of the agencies that are represented here today, people don't look to the federal government to tell you those things, right? So we are not the universe where people say, hey, I'm struggling with something, where should I turn to for help? I bet the federal government has a bunch of resources that are going to tell me those answers. And so we can do our job very well and kind of produce a bunch more evidence, but really trying to make sure that that's actually translating into what's happening in our case, in schools and districts every day requires a ton of other partners and really requires people testing out different ways to make that transfer more viable. One piece I really want to touch on here, because I think as much as you say sort of the water's not that cold, I think there's there's a real risk that we could sort of do all of this and end up in a universe where people are going to come up with pretty mixed results, right? So, John, I think, John Barron, you were here earlier somewhere. You sort of tested a number at something recently where you said, well, 90% of RCTs show that sort of nothing happened, and sort of nothing works. And so what are we going to, so if you assume some failure
In
rate, in aggregate, right? So if you assume anything close to that kind of a failure rate, if we spend a bunch of money on evidence-based practices, generate a bunch of information, and discover that 90 or 70 or 50% of what we've been doing doesn't work the way that we thought it would work, it's certainly true in the private sector that that might seem like a victory. It is also true in the public sector that that would not seem like a victory, and that we would all sort of have to look ourselves in the mirror and wonder if we need to take our balls and go home. And so I think the work for all of us to do here to sort of make it more viable for people to actually say, here's the evidence that I want, here's how I'm going to incorporate into these larger pools of funding and really change my organization, is we have to also make it okay for people to test out things and to learn, to share that information with each other, and to sort of say, hey, it didn't work, and that's not something that we need to run away from. That's something we need to understand better. So why didn't it work? Did we find out something that was sort of different than we intended? Was there some other spillover effect that we never took into account? And how do we capture those lessons and really make sure that people aren't running away from those, but are actually embracing them and using to build on what they do next?
Okay. Aviva?
Sure. So what I mostly wanted to do was to draw out what's really an obvious but I think important distinction that's been implicit in a lot of what other people have said, which is the distinction between scaling up innovation funds and what innovation funds do in their practices versus scaling up specific tested interventions that have been validated through innovation funds and other forms of evidence and that we have found work. And I think both are important, but they take you in somewhat different directions in terms of what needs to change or needs to be accomplished. So first, for purposes of scaling up innovation funds and other evidence building efforts, I'd point to, three of many things that we probably need to do. First, I think we need to make it a lot easier and cheaper to do high-quality evaluations, right? If what we want is for people to do more of these and do them in a more routine way, it's got to be easier than it is now. I think one important thing to think about on that front is data access, opening up administrative data resources for purposes of evaluation, which can have order of magnitude impacts on the cost and difficulty. But it's also really boring technical issues like how we design evaluations to maximize statistical power. So just to pick up on what Nadya was saying, one of the reasons that we don't find impact from evaluations is that interventions didn't work. Another reason is that we're often running, very underpowered or sort of poorly designed evaluations, and that's bad for everyone. We've wasted resources on not learning anything. We've created a sense that evaluations never find anything. I think that, it is a more boring issue than some of the other things that we've talked about, but I think it's potentially equally important. And then I think also in this category, we need to think about different structures. Innovation funds are one great structure for building this kind of evidence. There are other innovative funding structures that can help build evidence and help utilize other kinds of funds. And one that we're very excited about at OMB right now is performance partnerships. These are pilots that were authorized in the Omnibus Bill, 10 of them, that would allow state or local governments to apply to blend funding. And in exchange for that increased flexibility, they would have to measure outcomes in rigorous and trustworthy ways. And we just put out a consultation draft on how we're contemplating using that pilot authority, and you should take a look. We think it's a very exciting opportunity. Moving to the second category of how we scale up specific proven interventions that work, I think there are a few things to think about. Others on the panel have made great points about competitive funds. I think there are a number of departments that have done a good job of utilizing the flexibilities they have to push funds away from less tested and towards more tested practices. My favorite example in this category is HUD and Housing First and permanent supportive housing, but there are others. I'd also say, being from OMB, it's a big budget out there. We sometimes get trapped in little corners of it, but there's also mandatory programs. We have the great example of the Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting Program, which was funded with mandatory funding in the Affordable Care Act and was just extended for another year this March, which was a big success, another year at $400 million, hopefully meaning that will become a permanent program. and our budget proposes to scale it up further. That's probably not going to happen, tomorrow, but it is how you actually generate scale when you have really, truly tested, proven approaches. And then finally, I can't resist mentioning the tax side of the budget. That's where I spend a lot of my time in my role at OMB. And Carla mentioned the earned income tax credit, which is one of the most tested, most proven policy tools we have in terms of reducing poverty and promoting work. We have a proposal to expand that for people without children. That's an example of, based on evidence, taking something to scale. I think we in this community here often don't think as much about the tax side, but there are a lot of big dollars. There's a lot we know about things that could work better or that don't work. And thinking about that whole picture, I think, is important, particularly as you think about, scale and impact.
Okay, thank you. A question for the panel, and I would put it to you first, Aviva. We spent a lot of time talking about administrative shifts and changes here. There were a couple of mentions of legislative work, in terms of overall budget numbers, but you mentioned the performance partnerships. Is there sort of a congressional constituency or shifts that could be made in Congress that would enable, I'm wondering if that would enable us to expand our sense of what's possible here. And you might have the best picture on that given your perch, but what's your take on the ability to kind of rally more of a constituency than currently exists in Congress for this type of work?
I think that's a big question with a lot of dimensions to the answer. One dimension is the constituency for evidence and data. And I think there is such a constituency, and I think it's growing. I think one thing that might make you anxious in thinking about that constituency is, on the one hand, there's a growing constituency for evidence and data. On the other hand, there's often a lot of anxiety about data sharing and somehow, communicating that data access, data sharing with appropriate, careful privacy protections is a really important part of measuring impact and promoting better evidence-based policy. I think that's a place where, we could hope to make progress. There's also a question of the constituency for specific evidence-based practices and taking things to scale, which is, a multifaceted question. And then finally, there's the question of how the overall budget envelope, creates or constricts opportunity. I think we sometimes talk about how in an environment of constrained resources, evidence is even more important, which is absolutely true. But I think it's also the case, being realistic, that a more constrained discretionary funding environment tends to constrict opportunity for exactly these kinds of really creative approaches. And what we saw in the omnibus is that when we increased the discretionary caps, it did make room for disproportionate growth in innovation funds and a number of other really important things. So I think that, again, to be the messenger from OMB, thinking about that broader budget envelope as a driver of opportunity is important.
Okay. Other reflections on this point?
I have one piece I'd like to add.
Sure.
Just it was
Sure.
a point that you made, but kind of went quickly through, and I'll just sort of dwell on it for a second here, which is that I think as much as the folks in this room may think that doing things that are evidence-based is intuitively appealing, a lot of people that are making a range of decisions have a lot of different incentives in place, and that doesn't make them bad people. It means that they are responding to kind of their particular environment. And so I think when we have some of those conversations, what we often hear is people are sort of lukewarm, mediocre. They're sort of okay on the evidence stuff and okay on the innovation fund stuff, but they might be really fired up about a city year or a sort of particular organization. And I think it's actually, we haven't done as good of a job as we could do actually making that connection, right? And saying that actually city year is part of that. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of if you are okay about this but really excited about them, maybe you should actually think about the fact that it funds 13% of city year's budget, and it's affecting what the organization does overall in a really positive way that they feel good about. And I think really helping make those connections can be potentially catalytic in the coming years.
Okay. We're going to open it up to the floor here in a minute for questions, but before we do that, do any of the panelists have additional questions or observations they would have based on the discussion so far?
I guess I just wanted to, just one thought that, I think one of the constraints we face or challenges we face is that people are we're worried about what the results are going to be. This on-off switch problem, versus program improvement. So, and that's a big obstacle. And I think, many of the groups on the ground do get religion once they get into this, just as Michael was sharing, get excited about it because they know they can do better. But still, we're fearful that somehow things are going to get cut off. And so I just wanted to mention this notion, which I think a lot of groups are looking at, around more rapid prototyping. How do we do things fast, smaller, so we learn from them, and also kind of using levels of evidence at the right time with the right projects. And I think because there's this rush toward we need more evidence, people may go too far, too fast, and sort of undermine their case. So I think we have to be careful about that.
So I'll put one question for any panelists who'd like to take it up, and it's something that came up earlier today that and Carla, you just referred to it, that when we talk about evidence, we think about it as these, massive randomized trials over multiple years, and at the end of the day, it's Head Start, thumbs up, thumbs down. And the reality is that aggregate reading, doesn't, that there's thousands of Head Start programs, underneath that, some of which are truly excellent, some of which are so-so, some of which aren't that good. And so, would be interested if anyone here on the panel has, seen or worked on ways of identifying within one of these massive programs those parts of those sub-programs or parts of it that are working well, and kind of use that as a basis for improvement. Something, Michael, you referred to a bit, but Bob, do you want to?
Yeah, let me address that because I think it's very important. I think there's a really important distinction to be made between evaluating. I mean, the word program means two completely different things.
Yeah.
We're in Washington, where the word program means some giant federal thing, like Title I or Head Start.
Yeah.
But out in the rest of the world, program means a much more well-defined thing that's got a specific set of procedures and training and materials and so on. And to use the tools of evaluation to evaluate something the size of Head Start, I mean, that's not to say that you can't evaluate it, but it's almost worthless to try to do it, because there is so much under that. Or to say, is Title I effective? It's like saying, is money effective? It's, well, you can argue about is money effective, but it's money spent on what? What are you doing with it? So you could, you can look within Head Start, you can look within Title I, you can look within other things and try to learn something. But when you're really trying to find, sharp-edged, what works and what doesn't work, the much more productive way to think about it is this. Under Title I, let's say, there are thousands of things that could be paid for, that are being paid for as we sit here, and that are very susceptible to being evaluated in high-quality randomized trials. Over a period of time, if you found out what were the things that did work under Title I, and you got people to use more of those, then overall Title I would continuously get better and better in terms of its outcomes. As more effective things were used and less effective things were used less. That's the way I think we should be thinking about using evaluation tools, because the other is just a political nightmare. If you say you're going to go out and evaluate Head Start or Title I or things of that size, then immediately, for good reason, people's hackles are up. They think, the reason you're evaluating is so you can cut it off or reduce it. What you need to be able to say is we all understand that something like Head Start should exist, something like Title I should exist, something, like all of the kinds of things. These are things that despite our political differences, we all understand that there are certain things that just have to be done, but they have to be done better. They have to actually get the result. And you're not going to get to that by evaluating the whole thing and deciding whether it's effective or not. You're going to get to it by designing better and better ways to get to the result. Just as happens in medicine. They don't say, oh, cancer research, gone. We're not solving enough cancer, so we're not doing it anymore. They say, let's evaluate this treatment and this treatment for this problem and that other problem. And over time, over decades, things keep getting better and better and better because of that kind of research applied at a smaller level, not at the level of, is cancer research a good idea?
Okay. Questions from the floor?
Mike Lawson, George Mason University. This is a question I ask in the small group on cities, but I guess you thought I should ask it again, or I'm going to ask it. The issue is so much of Moneyball is focused on policies, what policies work, what programs work. Again, with that loaded nature of the program, what strategies work, but also what came out of the city's discussion was that there are structural issues, management issues, organizational culture issues, that there's a culture of using evidence and innovation. And so is it the program that's successful, or is it the management structure within which a wide array of programs or strategies might be placed? So, and so I guess my question is, what role are those management structures? And when we think of management in terms of funders, that's overhead. and so you're trying to build, in effect, overhead, but it's really building capacity for innovation and evidence-based work. So,
Well, what I might do on this one is maybe have Carla and Michael both weigh in, because you're overseeing kind of a portfolio of companies. Just what's your take on that, Carla?
Yeah, and I heard Nadya say earlier, the mechanisms for knowledge transfer are difficult, so there's that issue, and then there's just managing and excellence in management, the quality of actually carrying out these programs. And I guess my thought there is a couple of things. One you ended with, and Clara Miller, who many of you know, was at NFF for years now at Heron, she was arguing for years that we're under-resourcing nonprofit, quote-unquote, overhead through government contracting, and we're not talking about that at all here. But at the end of the day, if we're going to have excellence in the way these programs are carried out, and we're completely under-resourcing the operations of the organizations we expect to carry them out, be they public or nonprofit, I think we're going to run into a buzzsaw. So that's kind of one issue. Second, I guess I just did want to mention, I do think that this formula that the SIF, the Social Innovation Fund, hit on, it is a combination of evidence, intermediaries, and an appetite for scale. And while I think many of the large agencies have certainly used intermediaries, have certainly thought about evidence, have certainly tried for scale, I don't know that on any kind of routine basis those three things are put together. And I think what's beneficial there is that the intermediaries, the good ones, generally are focused on operational excellence, how to leverage resources for that, build that, as well as the ability just institutionally to use data to drive performance and actually execute on that. So I do think there's more that we could do with kind of those three strands together being used by some of the mainstream agencies as the way they fund.
By the time you evaluate something, hopefully there's been evidence-based practices that have been poured into the organization. There's been trainings. There's been all kinds of work before you get to the point of saying, now we're going to do an expensive study on it. And I think actually there's potentially more bang for the buck in that. If there were audits that were done sort of in a nice way of saying, we can come and help you take a look at, are you using evidence-based practices? What metrics are you using? Are they research-based? And really, as I said before, introducing those concepts into organizations is very powerful. That, I think, then leads to, once you're really driving more and you get hungrier for more evidence-based practices that drive those research-based metrics, and it's really a flywheel effect. And then you get excited about, we're ready to go prove this now because we really feel like it's tied to these kinds of things. What I've seen since we did this transformation and have really tried to do evidence-based practices and everything against our metrics is that we've had to build a national office of essentially education practitionership, where we now really try to bring in the best minds that are working in education, say what are the best practices on attendance, on behavior, on course performance, and who are the philanthropies that are working in those areas. And they've become conveners to say, we want to bring you all together. And then what we do is we retrain our staff every year at our academy for a 2-week period to say, these are our new practices. And then we go around and we try to make sure that everyone's actually doing these kinds of things. But our core members at the end of the day are the ones that are delivering all this, and we're kind of turning them into data geeks and evidence geeks. And it's really fun when I ask them how they're doing. And yeah, they'll tell me a great story, but they'll also tell me a statistic. And that tells me it's beginning to sort of get through on that.
Okay. Shelley, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just going to, one, I'm very glad the question's being asked about the culture, and I do want to ask sort of the education, Aviva and Nadya, how do you get it so that there's iterative experiments? It's not sort of these one-off massives, but where we really build a learning community and an improvement community. But I also want to mostly take advantage of Michael Brown's question with Aviva sitting next to him, where he said, OMB's getting in the way of the indicators where the evidence is showing these are the right precursor indicators where we can influence these. That's not the language you used. So Aviva, I don't know if you know about this, but I don't want
Boy,
to
great former colleague there, turning on you.
But no, because I think I want to make sure it's a real barrier, and if not, that it gets taken on in the future, because that just seems silly.
Yep.
So I'm not familiar with the particular issue, so obviously I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. To your other question about iterative experimentation and culture, maybe I'll let Nadya take the sort of people and culture side of that. I come at it a little more from the technical side because of my background, and I come back to the toolkit that I mentioned at the beginning, which is, right, the way to make it more feasible to do that kind of iterative experimentation is to measure outcomes in administrative data so that you can have a really large sample and see, is your intervention working for some people and not for others? Is it working at some sites and not for others? You can't realistically do that if you're doing everything with an expensive survey. But then likewise, making sure that you're designing your evaluations in ways to maximize statistical power, again, is a technical issue, but it really bears on that question of whether you're going to be able to dig down and learn something beyond, are you over or under some specific statistical, cutoff?
Sure.
Go ahead, Nadya.
Just to answer that, try to address a little bit of your other part of your question, a couple of thoughts. So I think first, structurally, one of the ways that we've tried to think about this iterative process is putting into place a set of evidence standards that sort of emphasize the kind of iterative nature of this work and the idea that it's not necessarily linear, right? So you might sort of learn something, you might hop back a little bit, you might kind of, and that really trying to encourage that as a framework. And we published last year a joint set of evidence standards with the National Science Foundation, which for folks in the education world, there tends to be a kind of big divide between folks that get money for really early stage research from National Science Foundation versus folks that kind of get federal money from the Department of Education. And so really trying to kind of better bridge that universe to get exactly at that question. I think on the slightly more micro sense, grantees have a lot of leeway to apply for and use our funds in ways they choose to do so. And in some way, right, this is also a question of really making sure that we are generating kind of demand and interest in doing that work on the ground. And sort of those are some of the pieces that Bob and Michael have been speaking about earlier, right? And sort of making sure that we can then kind of point to those examples, because the room is there for people to do it. They just have to want to do it. On the last piece around culture, I think that's a really tricky one. I'm not sure the federal government is in a super awesome place to help figure out how to kind of help individual organizations think through organizational culture. But I will just make sort of one general plug here, which is that I think this work is hard, and we all do this work because we really care about improving outcomes for high-need communities. And it can be discouraging to do a bunch of work that's not having the impact that we want. And so I would like to hope that by virtue of sort of thinking more about evidence and really focusing on what works, that we also think differently about who we end up retaining and who we end up attracting to this world, which I do think kind of in the long run can change some of those cultural structures within our organizations.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I share the panel's enthusiasm for the Investing in Innovation Fund. And I have a question, I had a thought I'd be interested in on how it might be portrayed politically, even if there are a number of null findings, which could probably be expected. One of the things that was done in I3 in setting it up was that there are, as you know, different tiers, and most of the grants go toward, as Bob described, building the shelf in the moderate tier and the developmental tier, which is sort of the experimentation, and it was described as we don't know whether these things work, there's promising evidence, they might not. But you did sort of say for a few, the scale-up grants, where we're betting our biggest grants, these are things that are backed by strong evidence already. There was a very strong signal from the prior research. There was a prior randomized trial of Success for All and Teach for America, and some pretty good evidence also for reading recovery and KIP. And if those pan out, and the replication trials suggest that they are. There are at least some encouraging initial results. Could that be portrayed as a success? That's the hoped-for outcome. In addition, hopefully you'd get some positive findings, at least some positive findings from the other tiers. And to point to medicine as an example, you know, the majority of phase 3 randomized trials in medicine do not produce positive findings, yet if you have a few examples of things that really do produce meaningful effects, everybody stands up and salutes, and the Congress appropriates the money year after year. I'm wondering if sort of there's a way to, I guess, portray this that can attract political support.
I'd like to feel that.
I mean, yes, and so I think there is, and I think kind of the piece that you're talking about in particular, if some of the larger grants prove to really be achieving the impact that they intended to have at the scale that they intended to have, we should consider that something very meaningful. The addition I would add to that is that often when we talk about sort of scaling and increasing impact, we talk about that as something that an organization does. So we sort of say, let's have what you do, let's have you do more of it better. And that is one way to scale. I also think the other piece that we should sort of hold ourselves to is making clear kind of what is it about the secret sauce of those organizations, how are they doing that work, and how do we actually enable other folks to take that on? Because I don't think we live in a world where even if we had sort of unlimited amount of resources, if we just gave every organization more money, that everybody would automatically keep doing the stuff they're doing really well at exactly that same high level of quality, kind of writ large. And so I think trying to also use that as a way to enable other people to kind of get into that game, I think is also an important piece of that.
Good. Well, we are coming up on the appointed hour. I think what I'd like to do is to have each panelist, you know, based on this conversation, just offer 1 or 2 sentences, just concluding thoughts, observations, things you're taking away from either the discussions today or this panel in particular. And maybe, Bob, we could start and work our way down from here.
I think that there was some commentary throughout the day about the different ways of improving things that have to do with improving existing organizations, changing culture, using data more intelligently. The whole geek city concept within RFA is a good example of this. That's a perfectly legitimate way to do improvement, but it's a very different way from the notion of creating and then evaluating and disseminating proven programs. The two should not be in conflict with each other. If you are intelligently designing a city or a city school system or whatever other element of government, you'd be crazy not to use things that are ready to go off the shelf, known to make a difference as part of your strategy. You'd also be crazy to use only those things, because you'd have to be innovating for your own city, in your own context, for your the situations that are unique to you, and that doing things that are not necessarily even going to be of interest to the next city, but that using data intelligently and creating a culture of doing so has got to go along with this other movement and not be seen as an opposition to it.
Okay, Carla?
I think building the public case is essential to making this happen. I mean, I think if the culture's not going to change until the public believes that, we're confident that the good things that really make a difference are being funded. And I think that's fundamentally what's undermined where the public is on the government right now, the U.S. public. And so I think the Results for America effort and this whole effort is critical if, as a result of it, we build confidence that we actually can and will accomplish results with the trust and the money that the people put in us. And so I like this idea, obviously, of lifting up what good examples we do have, because I think that's critical in terms of making the case. And a second quick point I just wanted to make is, we have known for a long time about certain things that work and are cost effective through data. I mean, the simplest one to think about is drug treatment versus interdiction. And yet we don't do these things. And so I do think that the power of what's happening now has to be some forcing mechanisms. And I think Pay for Success might be one of those. there are others that we've talked about. But I think there's going to have to be some forcing mechanisms for the good things that there's evidence works and are cost effective to actually get into the mainstream of public funding.
I'll just piggyback on that and on the comment about success stories. A success story for these practices is a case where you learned something from some sort of rigorous evaluation that you otherwise wouldn't have known, and then you did something differently and it made things better. I think we do have some of those stories, more than we sometimes talk about, and then obviously we need more of them, and that's how you build the constituency and the demand for the practices.
I think there's definitely a role to connect all the dots, as you were sharing before, between the nonprofits, between the policies, and the political realm, and getting congressmen and women to visit programs and to see what does work, I think is probably the main thing that will break the logjam in Washington between folks who don't want to spend or only want to spend sort of ideologically. That we really are at an impasse right now, and it's the what works movement that could actually move us out of it. So we, who are getting these funds, have an obligation to do the best we can to actually prove that it's working, which is what we're trying to do, and an obligation to connect the dots and bring members of Congress and senators to see these programs and say, this is where it's coming from, and this is why you should support it no matter what your philosophy is, because it works.
Yep. Thank you. Nadya.
And I would actually just note that as much as we have work left to do, I actually think we're in a really fun phase of this playing Moneyball business. And I say that not just because the Oakland A's are my home baseball team. I say that for two reasons. The first is that actually increasingly we're seeing, certainly with some of our I3 grantees as well as some others, that are really kind of focused on this question around what works, that for the folks that are starting to have kind of mixed results or middling results, they're actually in a really interesting phase where they have pretty good information about what that looks like. And we are doing our best to really support them in their endeavors to try to think about how they may be able to kind of course correct and keep learning in this process. And so that is something that's perhaps not the most exciting, but actually a really fun place to be. And the second, which I think we've sort of touched on, is that I think we are also starting to see for some of this work really some promising results. But in some way, what's most notable to me is that for almost all of the grantees that I've had a chance to talk to, certainly recently, they may have promising results in the area that they expected to have, but everybody pretty much uniformly also has a really interesting spillover effect. So something they didn't expect would happen as a result of taking on this work, that's really meaningful. So I was talking to a grantee the other day, and they were talking about how sort of as a result of a different kind of partnership, they have much more access to university-based researchers, and so they can now surface real problems of practice to those folks who are eager to take those on. That's not something we pay for through our grant. It's not something that we intended in some sort of explicit way, but it's something that has kind of built up and is now part of the work that they do day in and day out. And I think that's a really fun place for us all to be.
Okay. Well, I'll close with this last observation, which is I think to have to play Moneyball, you need great entrepreneurs in the nonprofit sector, the philanthropic sector, and also in the government sector. And we've have a great example of people from the nonprofit and the government sector up here, and we're about to hear from another terrific entrepreneur in the government sector, our friend Jim. And so with that, we could have a round of applause for our panel. Thank you.